Thanks, Roseanne. You will get to see, I think it's probably easier to be a soccer program director for 179 residents than a soccer coach for 5-year-olds. But nevertheless, I try to do that as well. I'm going to talk to you about EPAs really as they relate to internal medicine residency training. They are trickling down potentially to medical school education, and they certainly are going across specialties. So I hope that the description will be general enough to feel applicable to everybody. And as Roseanne mentioned, there's been a lot of change over the last few months. And even in my email yesterday morning from the AIM group, there was a comment about changing of EPAs. I decided not to really read that because I had already done most of my talk. So what the heck is an EPA, and do I need to know about it? First of all, a couple of disclaimers about the way the literature is written on this. Much of what has been written by this gentleman. That's not me up there in the upper right-hand corner. That's Ole Tenkate, and he's done most of the work on EPAs and really coined the term in terms of medical education. So one or two groups have really been responsible for this. The other group, besides the group in Utrecht, has been the ABIM and the ACGME working groups on the Milestones projects. There is no evidence to support the use of these tools in terms of their outcomes. There does seem to be, though, a consensus of the expert opinion from the Outcomes Project that it didn't result in useful tools for assessment across GME specialties. So while we don't have evidence that the EPA system necessarily works, we do know what we were doing before was probably not working. So Roseanne didn't know that I was going to have pictures of the boys in here, but it does help me explain these concepts in the most simple way. So in an approach to an EPA, you might think something like this. Do you trust this boy to walk this dog alone? All right. Well, you'll see it depends. So my goals are to share the definitions that are pertinent to the next accreditation system, because I think that's something that all of us are going to have to deal with to some extent, and some of us more than others, and discuss 3 questions that I think about related to the EPAs. First, what are they? Very basically, might they be helpful? And that's for you, Tom. I think I threw the might in there. I put the might in there to allow for some cynicism and maybe some skepticism. And what, if any, are the current requirements for using them? So then I'd like us also to consider potential controversies about the next steps in this process. While I was putting the talk together, I felt myself trying to decide if I was going to be pro or con, or was I going to do a pro-con conversation, which kind of would be too awkward. So I would like to start with why this conversation is important and talk about the history that led us to where we are using these EPAs. Clarify the language, because I think that's one of the biggest problems is the changing language that's been happening. And that's step 1, 2, and 3, to put us all on the same page. We can't have conversations about this if we don't know the definitions of the words that we're using. And it is a moving target, so bear with me a little bit on that. I'll go through what evidence there is and some experiences, because a lot of the evidence is actually experience, and I do think it's growing and there's opportunity for research then. And then future of assessments in our program and maybe in yours as well. So here's the timeline and a little bit of the history. So evaluate and assessment is an age-old struggle, I think. I would have to say that in the 1900s, they talk about in the medical literature the Flexnerian revolution, where we're actually adding standards to evaluating people and measuring types of medical education, deciding on some rules that we all play by. And that went along sort of in the do one, see one, teach one, the apprenticeship model, some time steeping in activities until the 1970s and 80s when people started talking about competency and the construct emerged in the different professions, not just the medical profession, but the nursing profession, and also in some ways to public health and the way that public health physicians were working and assessing their learners and also the outcomes of what they were doing. Pediatrics, as always, just like they do in the patient-centered medical home, took the lead on competency development and were the ones who were willing to sit back and say, you know, just the amount of time or just doing things may not be enough. We need to decide on what makes you good. And so they tried to make that movement happen in pediatrics, but there was a lack of adequate assessment tools. And then it sort of died down, and competency-based education didn't go forward. We continued to just do what we had been doing before. In the 1990s, there was a switch, though, from this idea that things should be measured in terms of process and content-based training to competency-based training. And Family Medicine's RRC led the charge again. And it's interesting, in my mind, as I was looking at this, to see how the patient-centered medical home mirrors these changes. So pediatrics was first, then family medicine came. And, you know, some of the rest of us straggled along a little bit. And that's when they really put their foot down and said, you know, do one, see one, teach one. See one, do one, teach one is not the way to do things. We need to think about really thinking of competencies. And the nursing schools also came on board and expressed concerns that we were emphasizing skills instead of thinking. We were emphasizing, can you putting in the IV rather than deciding why to do it. So they also joined forces with the family medicine folks and the pediatricians. In 1999, all of us were involved in medical education at that time. The ACGME came out with the 6 competencies, and the decade of competency-based medical education from 2000 and 2010 sort of was born in medical education. And we all started memorizing them and implementing them and trying to decide how to measure them. The outcomes project from the ACGME was also part of that rollout of the competencies. So here's a diagram, I'm not sure how well that projects, of the difference between structure and process versus competency-based education. Just looking at starting from the driving force of the curriculum, it says content and knowledge versus outcome and knowledge application. The driving force for the process, interestingly, switches from the teacher, so Osler telling you how we're going to do things, to the learner trying to say what they need to learn and driving the process. The responsibility of the content became shared decision making, so from the teacher to the student and the teacher together. And then the goal of the encounter was not just knowledge acquisition, but application. So these things, to me, when I read them, they sound great, but I'm not sure we've actually been measuring them or achieving those goals. And that's sort of what was found in the next look at this. This is what the goals were in 2000 when the Outcomes Project was rolling. This group of researchers, including several program directors, said this is where we're shifting to. This is what competency-based education is going to be like. There's going to be variable time. It's interesting they started even then saying that the program completion was going to be variable time based on competency rather than dwell time. So the Outcomes Project from 2007 to 2008 was assessed, and they looked at, so this project that we've been doing, have we come up with any assessment tools that are valuable? And they tried to do their best evidence-based look. The ABIM was involved in this. Eric Holmboe was involved in this. An evidence-based look at the assessment tools that are used in medical education to evaluate competencies. And they rated the tools on a few things: validity, reliability, ease of use by the evaluator, and the educational impact that it was having. And then they created a rating scale, like we do for other evidence-based things, level grade A evidence for using this assessment tool. Class 1 was recommended, Class 2 was one that we should consider, and Class 3 was for provisional use. No Class 1 tools were found. So we developed this, we all put in our efforts to implement the competencies, but no Class 1 tools came out of it. A CEX is not a Class 1 tool. So more work to be done. So then Tom Naska, who's the CEO of the ACGME, in 2008 looked at this evaluation and these recommendations from Eric Holmboe and said, we need to move forward with the next step in competency-based education, which is the Milestones Project. So the Milestones Project brings together the ACGME, the RRC, the academic specialty communities, develops specific specialty educational milestones that residents are expected to attain at specific times throughout their education. And this was really his warning shot, I think, about the coming of the next accreditation system. So what happened, what was new that we all of a sudden said this isn't working? I think what's really new, and this is me, I think, although it seems a little bit cynical, it's also pretty true, that it was outside forces. It's been outside forces that are pushing this change. There's been substantial external pressure on the ACGME and the ABIM and other organizations about why these measures need to be done. The Institute of Medicine in 2008, as all of you know, issued reports about resident duty hours, enhancing sleep supervision and safety, and retooling our educational system for an aging America. MedPAC, which is Medicare's utilization evaluation system, really cracked down and said we're not getting our money's worth out of medical education training, so we're putting all this money into postgraduate training and we don't know the outcomes. They're not working. You tell us that the outcomes project doesn't really create a better product than we thought. And also, we put these monies in for patient outcomes to be better, and they really, I think short-sightedly, honestly, link resident training directly to patient outcomes. And it's their prerogative to do that since they provide the money for the training. But it's a little bit tricky for us to be in that kind of catch-22 where the patient outcome, which is so dependent on many things like the system and like access and health insurance, et cetera. And then in Congress in 2011, this is the very scary part, started talking about reductions in GME funding, which gets everybody, especially an institution like this with 1,500 trainees, really nervous. So in summary of this first part, competency-based education was favored as a method of evaluating residents from the mid-1980s to 2010. The Outcomes Project, which really started with the ACGME competencies in 1999 to 2010, focused on developing tools and implementing the competencies into GME. Now, I did mention that those tools weren't necessarily, there's not high-level evidence for their use, but nevertheless, that's what we did. And I'll touch a little bit when we get to the definitions about why measuring competencies might have been the wrong thing to do the whole time anyway. Regulatory bodies and educators alike agreed that implementation of the competencies had not been successful, although we disagreed about it maybe for different reasons, at achieving the desired educational product, i.e. we still couldn't say with certainty that our doctors were reliably good. So here's a slide that probably many of you have seen multiple times over the course of this year. It was published early in 2012. Tom Naska, the CEO of the ACGME, is the lead author on this article of the next accreditation system. And he really does describe some of the rationale being to improve the quality of medical education, but also talks about those external pressures that have been significant drivers. And he's been non-apologetic about the fact that we need to show our funders a better outcome product, a measurable outcome. So I just wanted to go through this. I showed this at the medical education retreat for the internal medicine program, just to, again, to help us be on the same page. The next accreditation system is really outlined by these 9 elements. This is what programs are going to be evaluated on starting in 2013, 2014, and then other programs coming online later. Internal medicine is among the first group, as is, interestingly, neurosurgery and emergency medicine. So it's a pretty big catchment group that needs to come on board. The things that will be measured on are things that they care about already: attrition, changes to the program. And attrition, they mean resident attrition and also program director attrition. Program changes like adding another site, anything else that we do, adding another hospital. Scholarly activity of the faculty and residents. And at a big academic institution like this one, we meet this bar very easily. The board pass rate, again, they set a bar of 80%. Most of the programs in UPMC are in the 90s in their pass rate, including ours. The clinical experience, again, something at UPMC that's not ever really a challenge for us. The resident survey that all of our residents take anonymously every spring. The faculty survey is a new piece, and I know the GME office here is doing a lot of work to get us ready for what the faculty survey might look like. Unfortunately, they're going to ask things of faculty that may not be intuitive, like, are you trained by your program director to monitor your residents for fatigue? I look around the room at the Academy Master Educators here and see a whole bunch of people that I would love to have teaching my residents, but I don't want you answering questions on the faculty survey because you're not going to answer that question, know how to answer that question well. The milestones are highlighted here because that's most of what we're talking about today. There are 23 narrative milestones in internal medicine, which we have not yet seen. They're due out this week or next, and we're going to have to report them twice a year. From a range of 5 categories, from critical deficiency to aspirational. And then the clear visit is really Frank and Gabby's worry, which is the institutional site visit that emphasizes patient safety, quality improvement, and outcomes of the institution. And I think Tom Naska's goal and the ACGME's goal with that is to really make sure that if you're not a hospital environment that is caring about these things that are important to the outcome and the health of everyone as a population, then you shouldn't be able to train residents. Again, we're fortunate to be an institution where that's not an issue. Okay, so I promised we would try to be on the same page of definitions, and I would think a group like this would have 100% agreement about competency, but it's one that these are for me to re-emphasize in my brain. So competency is a particular ability or attribute. Competent is your ability, you can do all of the abilities. Competence is someone who does all of the abilities consistently, adapting to contextual and situational needs, and can be entrusted to do them independently. Now, this is from Kelly Caravasi's talk at the APTA meeting in 2011, and he's shown it many other times since then. But these definitions also are supported by other people. It's a little bit tricky. I rolled my eyes the first several times that I saw them, but right now what I do when I look at these words is think, oh yeah, well you can't measure that. We've been trying to measure that for 10 years. You can't measure an attribute because we don't watch it. It's something that you have. It's a good goal, I think, to have competence. But I know people in the room who are competent, but I don't know it because I watched you do something. Most of you, I haven't watched you take care of patients. So a little bit more, so that's competence, and you should be thinking, well, no wonder we couldn't measure that. Developmental milestones. A milestone is a significant point in development, and it helps to define appropriate developmental trajectory of a trainee. So no wonder that the pediatricians were taking the lead on this, right? Milestones identify discrete knowledge, skills, and attitudes expected of learners as they progress through training. Different from a competency. Here's that slide from pediatrics, right? So if somebody's going to walk along alone, so there's the skill of the motor milestone, and the age in months is at the bottom. Milestones don't happen one time. They happen over the course of time. If your infant is walking at 9 months, you better move stuff out of the way because you weren't prepared for that to happen. If they're not walking at 15 months, you start to get worried, like, uh-oh, is my kid going to walk? Or if you were my mother, a special ed teacher, you were like, uh-oh, she's not going to be able to read. When they get to 18 months, every kid should be doing that. If not, something is probably wrong. And so this is, the idea, the concept of the milestone. And you can apply the same thing to trainees. Providing intervisit care, for example, is one of the milestones. A trainee who steps right in from a top of the class of Pitt Medical School might be able to do some of that already in the beginning of their internship. What we hope is that at some defined period, and that's our job to really figure out, during residency training, we would be able to expect that every resident in our program was able to do it. Seeing patient in clinic alone is another one that we're going to talk more about. Some of our interns come in pretty prepared to see a patient for a common problem by themselves. But if they're not able to do that by the end of the first year to handle a routine follow-up patient of a person with hypertension in clinic by themselves, then we should be worried about their progress. So those are some examples of how the milestones might be used. They do help us describe qualities and activities that we want our trainees to be able to do. Use some of the same language for formative feedback. So I'm concerned about you because you're not able to do this specific activity. And tell great trainees what stretch goals might be. You're crawling really well at 9 months. If you can walk by next week, that's an amazing stretch goal. If you can see a patient independently today, what about seeing a more complicated patient by the end of next month? So we can also remediate struggling trainees more easily with specific goals and skills. Instead of just saying, I'm not sure about your patient care, we can say, you're not able to see patients independently because when you were counseling this particular patient, I noticed that you left out the part about the side effect of the blood pressure medicine. And it also helps us to communicate with accrediting agencies and each other, with fellowship programs, and also later with employers. The milestones do not do some important things either. We do not need to measure them 142 ways for every trainee, thankfully. There are 100, for those of you who don't know, there's 142 internal medicine milestones. They don't need to replace our individual rotation goals and objectives. They don't have to encompass everything we need to teach our residents. That would be impossible. And they don't take away the importance of individual role modeling and creative teaching of medicine. When I was preparing this talk and when I read the medical literature about milestones and EPAs, what bothers me the most, I realize, is I keep thinking like, well, what about that great teacher that I had who didn't know anything about this kind of stuff and showed me how to be a terrific doctor? Is his work not valuable? Are we who like to spend time one-on-one with our trainees not valuable? And I think there's room for both. So the internal medicine milestones define the abilities expected of medicine residents as they progress through training, and they try to integrate knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. They're developmental in nature, so we can see them across the time span, and they're inherently linked with one another across those core competencies. So the competencies aren't going away, but it's nice to know that you can look at one thing from multiple different directions. They're also now framed in behavioral terms. And this, I think, was the biggest problem with the competencies, that we were not measuring behaviors. We were measuring this mushy stuff that we don't know how to put into words. And they also set the stage for the assessment of competence. I used this slide in the retreat, and I really wanted to use it again because I love this scene from Men in Black where they snap the neuralizer at you and say, forget everything you've just heard, and I'm going to tell you something different. And that's what I have felt like as the ACGME has been rolling out the milestones and the EPAs. I don't need you to forget everything, but it has changed a little bit. So after all of that with the curricular milestones and the 142 of them being called developmental milestones, ABIM came out this fall and said, actually, we're going to call those curricular. And instead of the narratives, we're going to call them narrative milestones. So the 142 are going to be shrunk down into about 20 or 23 that we need to evaluate. Those also may be called subcompetencies. We're still together. And then there's going to be this emphasis on evaluation versus assessment. So evaluation will tie nicely probably into what Mike's going to talk about next week about whether or not this is about whether or not we're looking at the end of their training or as we're going along. And then entrustable professional activities have emerged as an important part of how to assess the milestones. They're used as an assessment tool. We learned this fall that they will not be reported to the ACGME or the ABIM, which was a change. We thought that entrustable professional activities would have to be reported. But I think they may be a useful framework. So here's where I try to make my case for that. So I think these two sentences are understandable. Do you trust this doctor to do X, Y, or Z? That's a really, I think, an easy question. It may be harder to say, for me to ask you, now tell me why you trust them to do it. Can you trust them to do X, Y, or Z alone? And I think about I think this is something that's applicable to each of your practice settings. Do you trust this person to tap this knee by themselves? Do you trust this person to take care of a patient in the CCU by themselves? Do you trust them to see your patient in the clinic? Do you trust them to deliver a baby by themselves? All of those things. Confusion lurks, though, so stay with me here. The competencies are what our evaluation forms claim to measure. We have them all sorted, patient care, medical knowledge, all of that is on there. But competency is ability or an attribute, not an activity. So we're trying to measure something that we can't. We can observe competence, so we cannot observe competence, so we must infer it from something that we are able to watch. We decide based on something that will allow residents to do things without us. So Tenkate, whose picture I showed up there, Ole Tenkate, is the one who coined this term of the entrustable professional activities. And his goal is to really try to help us identify the critical activities that constitute a specialty. The activities of which we would all agree should be only carried out by a trained specialist. The we all agree part is going to be challenging. Patients and instructors, entrustment of responsibility to a trainee is an essential concept in the approach. We have to turn over our patient care to them. So I like this definition of trust, firm reliance on the integrity, ability, or character of a person. In order to turn over, to entrust, to give over your care to another person, you have to have that understanding of their integrity, ability, or character. Entrustment and entrustable are actually not really words, but maybe they'll be that word of the year thing in a couple of years. So what does trust mean, and how do you determine if someone is trustworthy? Think about your residents and how you decide, or your students. Does your level of trust change based on things that happen, increase, or maybe decrease in some instances? This was published in Academic Medicine to assess the dimensions of trustworthiness. And they surveyed trainees and also trainers, academic physicians, about people. Knowledge and skill is important. Discernment, conscientiousness, and truthfulness. So knowledge and skill, that's a pretty straightforward one. They have to understand when they're explaining something to you, or they need to know how to do the procedure that they're about to do. Discernment refers to the trainee's awareness of the limits of his or her clinical knowledge or skill. And the example they use in the article is somebody who was on call by themselves, and one person was pretty confident and very good, but never called the attending overnight. And the other person was a little bit less qualified, maybe, had less medical knowledge, would be a trainee that you might worry about, but called immediately and understood where her limitations were in the care of the patient. And the question that they were asking is, well, which doctor is better? The one who works all night independently because they're good, but never calls and doesn't ever reach a limit where they're not sure what they're doing, or the one who recognizes, hey, this might be an area that I need help? Conscientiousness is another important component, and that refers to the trainee's thoroughness in data gathering and dependability in following through with assigned tasks. So I think this is helpful because these are specific things that we recognize and can give feedback about. I didn't entrust you to do that because I was worried that you did not collect enough data, or that you let this thing fall through the cracks. Truthfulness, I think, is a really easy one, but one that we maybe forget about, and it's the absence of deception, obviously. Very infrequently, I would say that they report that they did something that they didn't really do. It's very rare, or it's more common than I haven't caught it. It has happened, and it was almost like a violation. I felt very untrusting of that person from then on. I think this is the one way that a trainee can quickly move from the we trust you to we don't, is that catching them in something that they didn't tell you, or they did say they did something when they didn't. There may be variations in how much value we put on these as we give someone some trust. So some more about the EPAs. They're specific. They're knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are acquired over the course of training and that society and our profession believe are critical. So this is from the AIM website. These EPAs are intended to act as a starting point. There were 13 at the time they wrote this. There are 16 now. Are intended to act as a starting point or guide for program directors in the development of meaningful assessments that inform the evaluation of resident competence and ultimately inform the educational milestones reporting in the next accreditation system. So that's still on the AIM website, but they've told us that we don't have to report them. So I think that they're really trying to push us, though, to use these as a tool. Tenkate and one of his colleagues, Dr. Sheely, in 2007 in Academic Medicine, broke down the components that are essential for EPAs. In order to have, and I wondered about this with my dog walking experience. In order to be an EPA or an entrustable professional activity, it has to be part of the essential professional work in a given context. It requires knowledge, skills, and an attitude. It leads to recognized output of professional labor. So you have to see something that happens. It should be confined to a qualified personnel. So it's not an EPA if everybody can do it. That's not an EPA. And an EPA for internal medicine cannot be the same as every other EPA for other specialties in medicine. It should be independently executable in a time frame. It should be observable and measurable in process and outcome. And it should reflect one or more of the competencies so that you can infer the competencies from watching the activity. They also proposed, Tenkate also proposed these levels of entrustment. And this is where that incompetent to aspirational comes through on a 5-point scale. So level 1 would be the resident has knowledge and some skill, but is not allowed to perform the EPA independently. So that's a little better than our 0. That's like they can't do anything, and I wouldn't let them even see a patient. The resident may act under proactive, ongoing, full supervision. And I noted how much this reflects the supervision requirements that are coming along in the ACGME as well, and in the GME. The levels of independence are something that we're being asked to grade all our residents and fellows on. How do we decide that they're independent? So proactive, ongoing, full supervision. That's the attending at the bedside. The resident may act under reactive supervision. So that's the attending is, down the hall, and you call them when you need them, or they heard of the condition, or they're readily available on request. The resident may act independently. The attending doesn't have to be in the building, and the resident may act as a supervisor and instructor. There are obviously many things in the resident's day that have different levels of these. We allow them to conduct work rounds, but maybe not to do procedures on their patient unsupervised. So a summary of this section, the next accreditation system is going to require reporting of the narrative milestones on each resident. The EPAs, I'm going to call methods of assessment. The competencies are qualities that are not directly assessed, but are instead inferred to be present or absent based on observable activities such as the EPAs. I'm giving myself a window here to not have to use the EPAs. The curricular milestones, the 142, may be helpful to describe the activities and give feedback, because I do find the language helpful when I'm looking for specifics. The next step, I was not liking Dr. Tenkate very much before this article in 2007, where he talked about bridging the gap between theory and practice. I tried to figure out really hard if he's even a physician, and I don't think so. But he did say this phrase: we'd like to disentangle the competencies from the activities. And that makes sense to me. And then he threw a new term out there: consider STARS, statements of awarded responsibility. He does say, you may be wondering why I keep giving you all of these acronyms and if they seem like a pain, but he said they can be useful. It's a useful tool for people to have an acronym. We brand things all the time. I have that pin for the back to the bedside. The star makes sense. You've got a star that says that you're progressing. We put stars in our clinic for the CEXs. Okay. So when a trainee can do the activity, they may have awarded responsibility, because we have to decide when it is that we're going to award that activity. He also said maybe 50 to 100 EPAs would be able to cover the objectives of a training program. Now, before I went to AVDM in the fall, I would have said, are you kidding me, 100? But after I heard Eric Worm give his talk from Cincinnati, and the fact that he's mapped 480 EPAs to his internal medicine training program, 50 to 100 sounded like not very many to me. I think this issue of the granularity and how much observation do we need to do is going to be a real sticking point going forward. Not just because it's hard for everyone to decide, but it's because it's also, like we have to be doctors too. The variable length in training, remember that came back right there in the, in the original switch from process-based to competency-based. One on the bottom on the table was variable length of training. Tenkate also says that variable length in training is a natural next outcome. How realistic is that in our current structure? I'm not very sure. And if you look at having medical school education separate from postgraduate education, it becomes really tricky. What if medical schools have variable length of education too, and they finish after 3 years, and then they start residency? We'd have people at all different kinds of stage of training all throughout. Maybe I'm too narrow-minded about that, but I think that's going to be a real difficulty. There has been a study looking at the entrustment, and it's done in anesthesia. There's also one in psychiatry, but it was electroconvulsive therapy, and I really couldn't go through that one. So there's an anesthesia study of entrustment that looked at anesthesiology trainees. They surveyed them. There was about a 50% response rate. 32 trainees and 31 attendings were surveyed, and then 10 from each of those groups were individually interviewed as well. They got $75 for that. The survey focused on levels of entrustment for anesthesia procedures. And actually, one of our Med-Peds residents gave her senior talk last week about autonomy, and she cited this study. It's really one of the only ones out there. The faculty were asked about allowing the residents to perform on their own and how that decision was made. So this is an EPA. Tenkate is a co-author on this study. The residents were also asked about self-efficacy and how the environment contributed to their independence. So what are the factors that makes the attending decide that you can do this procedure? Factors that determine the decision to allow autonomy to entrust a task, a decision, or a procedure include the trainee, the supervisor, the circumstances, and the nature of the task. That's a lot of variables. And we're going to say we're going to measure and grant a star to somebody that has this much variability. So this is an example of the results. So these bars, you don't need to worry. I know that's blurry in the back. This is when the attendings would allow someone to perform something independently. And the activities are easy things over here, intubation of the airway. I know everybody in internal medicine like groaned when they said, oh, that's easy, all the way to like administering epidural anesthesia, which seems like an LP to me, so how hard is that? But anyway, easy over there, hard over here. These are attending ratings, and the colors from light colors to dark colors is whether they would allow a PGY1 to do it, or they would never let any of their anesthesiology trainees do that independently without them standing next to them. And what you can see is there's some early agreement that PGY1s, not very many attendings, this is a percent of attendings that would allow a PGY1 to intubate a patient by themselves. Even though that's the easiest task, you can see that there's some variability in whether or not they would allow a PGY1 to do it. As you go across, you get to the hardest activity, and there are still some attendings who would never allow it. Most of them, though, would require upper-level trainees, and nobody would allow a white-colored box, a PGY1, to do this really hard thing. So it's nice that there's a trend or a pattern, but it's not really very specific. Put your nickel down. I use these criteria, would never allow this person to do it. So that opens us up to the idea, to Tentakate's idea, that there are other factors. This is not meant for you to be able to read. I'm going to show you it on a different slide. This is a table that they use to tease out what factors determine the entrustment of the decisions. And they group them into factors of the trainee, the supervisor, the circumstances, which include like who's available, the nature of the task. This is where I'll tell a story from when I was on call at the VA as a PGY2 resident. We were the IOD, the intensivist on duty at night at the VA. Anesthesia was available from home to come in for an intubation. I had a patient in the surgical ICU who had one of those halo things on for his neurosurgery, and he lost his airway. We did the chest x-ray, and the ET tube was like here. And so he needed to be reintubated. And he's on like 50% FiO2. I called anesthesia, and they said it's going to take us about 45 minutes to get home, to get in. The respiratory therapist was there, thank goodness, and you would not entrust me to do that activity by myself in the SICU. The surgeons wouldn't trust me to do any activity in their ICU during the daytime, but in the middle of the night when no one else was there, anesthesia said, go ahead and get the bronch out from the bronch suite. And you guys can do that together. So the respiratory therapist and I put the bronch down, it's easy when they're intubated already, and advanced the ET tube. Again, not something that you would entrust me to do during the daytime. After hours with extended supervision, maybe is different. So that's what the trainees actually said during this process. The entrustment of activity depends on these four things. The nature of the task, which might be the risk of it. It's risky to intubate someone if you're a PGY2 medicine resident, especially if they have a halo on their head. The difficulty, it was kind of challenging to do something like that, is also a factor that plays into whether or not the entrustment is allowed. Other things, though, the level of training, confidence, and experiences of the trainee. I was married to a pulmonologist. Does that help with my experience in terms of being prepared? No, but what you're talking about here is, have they done the activities that already give you confidence that they can do it? And is it maybe a PGY1 should never be allowed to do some things, regardless of how awesome they might be. The circumstances, the daytime versus on-call were the biggest components of the circumstances that allowed that to happen. In pediatrics, we heard from Alex, it might be the presence of the family at the bedside and whether or not they'll allow the resident to do it versus the attending physician. The supervisor, the level of experience, and the sense of educational responsibility was the next most common. Experience was the most common, and you guys could probably have named that. The seasoned attendings are the ones who are comfortable allowing their trainees to have a little bit of leeway in what to do. The new attendings are more likely to be micromanaging and not letting go of it. But the other thing that I thought was really cool was that the educational responsibility, the sense of I need to be your teacher, was what contributed. And the residents and the attendings both identified that as one of the factors that contributed to whether or not they would be entrusted. There was a commentary, this article is written by Streckenberg, but there was a commentary written by Babbitt talking about this as well, and he kind of raised more questions than he did answers. I put this up there to be a little bit silly and get us back to where we were talking before about whether or not we would allow somebody to do something independently. Experience and willingness, if the homework is done, some of the things that we want to know about our trainees are applicable to a lot of the tasks that we look at. The supervisor is also important. A professional dog walker, somebody who wants to walk the dog. Dr. Follansby lives next door. He's a big dog fan. Maybe he wants to go, so he wouldn't let Mateo have independence. And then the circumstances. And then the circumstances. Are there other competing factors that are going into that? What this made me worry about is the ability to standardize. The number of factors that contribute to whether or not we grant entrustment actually raise more red flags to me about whether or not it's a useful tool to continuously do with our residents. Another example that isn't about EPAs was published by Kevin Hinchy from Bay State, is something that we do now as well. And this was an example from the EIP. In their PGY2 curriculum, similar to the junior hospitals, they have a manager curriculum where they do 3 months on the wards with no students. And what the trainees said is that they really liked the ability to do the transition. Transition is really a change in our state of mind. As an intern, you never get the sense that you're in charge. Looking up stuff for the patient or the patient's case, that's where your learning takes place. They weren't talking about EPAs here, but I actually think this model of allowing them to have graded responsibility is what the EPAs are about. And it gives us an opportunity to evaluate people at various stages. The themes that came out from the managers is that they had ownership of the patients, they did weekend cross coverage, and they did more self-directed learning. They had accountability to others. They felt accountable to the attendings and also to the nurses, the other residents, the other team members. They felt that they gained competence in patient management, organizational skills, prioritization. It really took them out from managing a whole entire team to actually focusing on managing their patient. They also grew confidence and got some of those levels that we were talking about earlier of knowing what they knew and what they didn't know and when they needed help. And then there was a lot of personal satisfaction, which is not something to forget as a value. The level of enjoyment and new relationships with the attending physicians and the anticipation of a teaching role was important. So I wanted us to consider a couple of examples of our own in terms of the residents, teachers, circumstances, and nature of the task. As you think about EPAs, consider what we already do in terms of graded autonomy, the personalities of residents, the confident resident, or the confident medical student. And I see this a little bit more in medical students. We've all had the kid on our service who is really smart and taking very good care of their patients, but doesn't necessarily always talk as much as the other one. And understanding that the way we grant responsibility might be influenced by something other than whether or not the person can do it is a really important thing to remember as we're trying to evaluate people and give them that entrustment. The teachers, the different types of educators and styles, that's important for me as a program director to hear. If I hear from a particular attending that they're not comfortable granting entrustment, I need to hear some more specifics about why that is to make sure it's not a quality of the educator more than a quality of the trainee. We do need to have faculty development around that so that we can standardize when we grant that independence. And then the circumstances. I think the impact of duty hours on this is really important to remember. Are we changing the ability for people to do things and take ownership or to be granted entrustment because of the duty hours? And we also have to guard against that thing that happened to me when I was independent in the middle of the night. I had to think on my feet. It's not a good idea to intubate people by yourself with the halo, et cetera, I agree. But the need to call for help, to trust another team member, the respiratory therapist, will not happen in our current situation because of the duty hours. So we have to be conscious of that and maybe do specific things to avoid allowing residents to progress. outpatient, inpatient, ICU, consults, there are different scenarios where these things might take place. And then the nature of the tasks are also important, and that's different across every specialty. The procedures, the decisions, the management, diagnosis, and counseling. So how do you decide? How do you decide to repeat more of the history in clinic? How do you decide to double check the labs or the orders in the electronic medical record on your patients? We all use different ways of deciding that. How do you decide to repeat the physical exam findings once they've already been presented to you? Is it because the family member is standing there? Is it because you don't trust the resident who reported them to you? Is it because you just have this sense of needing to do it yourself? To allow the resident to implement the plan without modification. How do you decide that what they decided was good enough or was what you would do? Another specific example, and I know Asher and our ambulatory group have been working on this, is granting autonomy to the intern and ambulatory clinic. I trust this PGY1 to care for the common problems in the ambulatory setting. And then I put Tenkate's levels of entrustment there. Resident has some knowledge and some skill, but is not allowed to perform the EPA independently. This would be an example of an EPA that we would need to use in clinic to allow that graded supervision. This is a list of the 16 internal medicine training EPAs. I'm not going to go through them, but it's not 50, it's not 100, it's not 480. I'm not sure how we're going to decide which ones and how many and how often we need to look at. So the next steps for me are to await the new narrative milestones, which are due early December, to catalog our current evaluations that are direct observations and see which of those might actually be EPAs. To decide on a few specific levels of responsibility and granting of independence that we would like to assess as a program. Whether it's one that we've already decided is seeing patients in clinic. Another that I've heard us talk about is running a ward team. When are you allowed to be the resident on a ward team with students and everybody? We think about that, and we do it a little bit by giving certain PGY2s a ward team in July and others not until January, but we don't do that formally. And then communicating with families is another one that I've seen used a lot of times, whether it's explaining a procedure or if it's delivering bad news. There might be some differences. If it's doing that family meeting to make decisions about code status, when do we allow them to do those things independently? The things I like about the EPAs is that trustworthiness is a worthwhile quality in a doctor. I like this idea of figuring out when and why we trust our trainees. We all love reading those statements that say, I would love for this patient, this doctor or this student doctor or this resident to care for my family members. I understand this sentence. I trust this resident to take care of that patient independently. We make these decisions all the time already. I make that decision every day when I'm seeing a patient with a resident, how much more I'm going to do or less. We have to be aware of the biases that influence the decision that are not related to the trainee's competence. Observation is required, and probably more of it, and the competencies overlap and then therefore can be assessed in multiple venues at once. Do we have to use the EPAs? This is our final question. The short answer is no. The leaders in NAS for internal medicine are fans of the EPAs, and I think we're going to see more of that. In the course of the training, when and where is the best place to do this? What existing assessments can be used or modified to capture the resident performance? These are kind of the practical issues around it. Can a particular milestone that is assessed in an EPA also be used to inform an assessment of another EPA and vice versa? Can we double dip on that? I think the answer is yes. I could assess all kinds of things about Mateo if I let him walk the dog by himself. Who can best perform this assessment? Is it going to be only the trained physicians, teachers? Is it going to be nurses? Will we like for patients to do it? And will we be able to capture this in a variety of clinical settings? So my final conclusions about what I learned about Next accreditation and how EPAs relate to it is that it's designed to efficiently assure taxpayers and regulatory bodies that the outcomes of patient care are connected to medical education and training performance. That's what NAS is designed for. The milestones are reportable steps along the way to becoming competent, independently practicing physicians. And EPAs are assessment tools that can hopefully be observed in the day-to-day life of our profession. Other assessment tools may be valid. And so just because only thing that's been written about these assessments is EPAs doesn't mean that there might be other things that we can use. Remember, in the Outcomes Project, They didn't find anything that was a level 1. Factors other than trainee competence contribute to the decisions we as attendings make to allow them to function independently every day. I think this is the thing that I learned most. There are a lot of other things that go into that entrustment. Recognizing these other factors might improve the way we actually grant that independence. There's a lot of variability. Doesn't that hurt? Okay, so you can't be an ID doctor and not show at least one gross picture. There were a lot more gross blisters than this. So for me, the rub is this. The next accreditation system is for the hospitals and the outcomes. And system-centered is not the same as learner-centered, and by George, not the same as patient-centered. Do we measure what we can instead of what matters? And I think we need to guard against that risk, and that's part of my job. Is the apprenticeship always bad? Dr. Hardison wasn't my best teacher. It wasn't okay for me to learn at his coat sleeve. You know, I think that apprenticeship model is something that we need to maybe maintain a little bit. It feels impossible to assess all the EPAs expected for a physician to act independently, and that's overwhelming. Gestalt is still sometimes an important piece, and Tenkate agreed with that. I'll give you a quote. And it's hard to adopt something so drastic without the evidence that it will or does work, but that's what we're being required to do. So some questions remain, and maybe we can study them. How many assessments are required and what types? Will measuring the EPAs and reporting the milestones improve quality of our doctors, and by what metric? And what is the likelihood that we are going to be allowed to implement variable length training based on milestone achievement? So I tried to look up stuff about the apprenticeship model, and of course the Royal Society of Medicine in England had a quote about that. The goals of education are too important to be left to chance or whim, so they must be defined rather than left to happenstance. But tacit knowledge and attitudes must be given due recognition and allowed to pass from teacher to learner by role modeling. Tenkate also said this, and this is where I started to like him again. The supervisor's subjective but expert judgment is potentially a richer source of information than most other methods of assessment. All the way around. All right. Clear as mud, right, guys? Thanks.
We have some time for questions.